So I'm Kelli Berens-Brink. I've got a podcast called True Crime IRL and another one called True Crime Sleep Stories. I've been podcasting for a little less than, around a year and a half or so. And I'm also the executive producer and editor of Truth and Justice with Bob Ruff and True Crime Binge too. So
Can you talk a little bit about your new show and what all that entails?
yeah, so my new show is True Crime Sleep Stories. And I came up with this concept because I know so many, especially females, but some guys too, who are like, hey, I just really listen to uh, true crime podcasts because I like to fall asleep to it. It's just soothing. And I think it's all about the storytelling and stuff like that, the soothing tone of voice. So I was like, I'm going to come up with a show that is specifically tailored towards the people who want that. Maybe not quite as much. I don't get quite as into the real meat of the stories. I keep them short. They're around 10 to 20 minutes each. And I just tell them, and the people who come on the show as a guest, we just tell the stories that, like, very soothing. We just kind of skim the surface of a true crime case. And I have been told that it actually works and people do fall asleep to it. So I guess it's a good thing.
That's awesome. Not too creepy to where people can actually fall asleep and not have nightmares and stay up.
I mean, it's definitely creepy, but we don't get into like the super detailed
Nitty
stuff.
gritty details. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a few stories that you covered, Precious Doe being one, which we could spend all day
Yes.
talking about. And another case that
Yeah.
I recently released, actually last week, the past 2 weeks, is that being Isaiah Sweet, who is a
Yes.
Iowa double murderer. And we could spend an entire episode, like I said, talking about the Precious Doe and Isaiah
And we
Sweet.
should.
So
Oh yeah, sometime. But yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so tell me, how did you learn about Isaiah Sweet and his case, and how did you get in touch
Okay.
with him? I know that you spoke with his mom as well.
I did. So it's interesting, kind of. I live in Iowa and I live in Manchester, Iowa, really small town. And I started my first podcast, True Crime IRL. I wanted to cover more like Midwest and Iowa cases around where I live that a lot of people like haven't heard of, just things that were really interesting to me and happened in my kind of my own backyard, so to speak. So I always got I get a lot of suggestions from people in the area I live in. They're like, "Oh, have you heard of this case? Have you heard of this case?" Because, well, for one thing, I felt before like I lived in a safe bubble where no crime happens and stuff. But the more I do all of this local stuff, there's a lot of crime. I mean, there's crime everywhere. So anyway, somebody suggested, they were like, have you heard of this Isaiah Sweet person who went crazy and killed his grandparents and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I haven't heard of that, but I looked into the case and I felt like it went a lot deeper than just some angry teenager who decided on a whim to kill his grandparents. So I reached out to him in prison. I wanted to get his side of the story. And it turns out there was a lot of the story that the media wasn't telling. So I communicated with him a lot and learned about his life and told his story. There was a lot of abuse, a lot of mental health issues, a lot of stuff that nobody in the media wanted to cover. They wanted to make him look like a monster. And what he did was monstrous, but I knew that there was more to it than that.
Yeah, talking to Isaiah was definitely, different, and it's an interesting case. Like you said, the abuse, aspect was never really reported in the media. And when I released my interview, like most of the comments were like, "This guy deserves to rot in prison," yada yada yada, which they probably didn't even listen to more than half the interview, because if you did, you would hear all the abuse he went through, and
Yes.
which is,
Yep.
beyond heartbreaking. A 17-year-old boy, he had nowhere to
I
go,
mean,
and
and it started when he was 3 years old. It was a lifetime of making this monster that people make him out to be. It wasn't his fault. I mean, what he did, yes, he was he wasn't an adult. I almost said he was an adult. He was, he probably knew it was wrong. I get that. It was wrong, but there was just so much more to the story.
So what's it like for you on the opposite side of the spectrum than what you're used to when it comes to corresponding with and talking to a convicted murderer on the phone or what have you?
Yeah, it definitely is the opposite side of the spectrum because I'm used to covering cases from, you know, kind of a more victim oriented angle. And it was kind of almost a little bit of a moral dilemma too. Like, I'm talking with this convicted murderer so closely and he did it. And so it's like, and I have sympathy for the victims too. But it was just, yeah, I just really, I feel like he was a victim as well in this. And I had never talked to a murderer before that I know of. So it was just, it was very different. It was very intimidating. Even just the process of being able to communicate with someone who's in prison, you have to be very committed to that. You know, you have to get on their list. You have to go through a screening process and really be committed to this communication. And so I had never done anything like it before, but it was important to me. So yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Sometimes it'll take me sometimes days, weeks, or even months or years to lock down an interview. I'm literally on the phone with the same prisoner for days, months, weeks, or even years. Like
Yeah.
sometimes
Well,
it can be real, time consuming, but at the end of the day, it's rewarding at the same time,
it
getting that
is.
interview.
And you probably, with what you do, you probably have to develop a certain level of rapport with these people before they're even willing to talk to you, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's always that chance you establish that rapport and like months later they're like, I changed my mind. I don't want to do it anymore. I don't want to talk to you anymore. Then it's like,
Yeah.
cool, thanks
And
for
we
wasting my time.
we see that all the time in like the movies and stuff where, an investigator tries to develop a rapport or something, and then you know the person who's in prison can change their mind at the drop of a hat, and we're at their mercy, I guess, for that. Yeah.
Right. So you recently stayed the night at the Viscilla or Vis, is that how you say it?
Villisca. Yeah,
Villisca
Villisca.
House.
It's hard to pronounce. Villisca Axe Murder House. Yes, I did.
Yeah, can you give me a little bit of history of that house and what your
Yeah,
experience was like there?
yeah, absolutely. Brutal story. It could have been the work of one of America's first serial killers, actually. So in 1912, the Moore family, it was Josiah and Sarah Moore, they had 4 children, and sadly, they had 2 little girls, the Stillinger sisters, spending the night for a sleepover that night. So 6 children, 2 adults. In the middle of the night, in June of 1912, they were brutally murdered with an axe in their homes while they slept. So it's still on the list of Iowa cold cases today, all the way back from 1912. The murder has never been solved. There have been numerous persons of interest and suspects, but yeah, nobody was ever convicted of this. They did make like an arrest and had a trial, but it was like a hung jury. So they never did convict anyone for that. And they're in the area. It was weird in that time frame, in the months before and after, there were a lot of very similar crimes that happened, like in Colorado, Kansas, Iowa, down south a little bit. And I don't know if anyone's read the book, The Man from the Train by Bill James, but he goes into this in depth. And he thinks it was the work of a serial killer. And he puts together lots of facts and evidence to support his theory. It's very interesting. Another great podcast that's done a lot of work on it is American Hauntings with Troy Taylor and Cody Beck. They've talked at length about the Villisca axe murder case. So it's a really interesting story. It's right here in Iowa where I live. So of course, naturally, I had a morbid curiosity about it. And every year in October, I go and I rent the house for an overnight trip. And I go with several paranormal investigators, some true crime podcasters. We spend the night, we try to, rustle up some ghosts and see if it's haunted, because people say it's like one of the most haunted places in America. Zach Baggins and all those like TV shows, Ghost Adventures, BuzzFeed Unsolved, they've all been to the Villisca Axe murder house and talked about the case. It's just interesting. It was so brutal, especially for the time, 1912, and the fact that it's still unsolved is just crazy. I think if it happened today, it would have been solved. We've got, DNA technology, cameras, just so many things. I think the case would have been solved today. But back then, they didn't have any of that. The crime scene was totally contaminated. And yeah.
Did you have any like weird experiences when you were out there, or any previous years for that matter?
Yeah, we brought all the stuff. We brought Ouija boards, recorders, like the EMF detectors and magnetic stuff, pendulums. We brought literally everything. And I'm a skeptic. Some of the people I was with, they were like, I heard this or this happened or whatever. But what was really crazy is after we got home and we all started reviewing our recordings and stuff, that's when it got weird, because you can hear some things that are not totally explainable in the audio. Like someone will be talking, but it'll sound like there's this entity whispering behind them or something like that. And I'm like, it's probably a coincidence, but it is creepy. So I'm not convinced that it's haunted, but I will say I did not like sleeping in the attic by myself. It creeped me out. So yeah.
So I'm a skeptic as well when it comes to like the paranormal. And I recently went to two haunted Airbnbs in Jefferson, Texas. The whole town's supposed to be haunted. And the
Oh,
first night we didn't really get anything. The second night I was like, you know what, screw this. Like I'm gonna be the bad guy. So I started like kind of, you know, I guess calling them out in a sense. Like there was supposedly like an
oh,
entire family had died there. So I was like, show
you
yourself.
were,
Are you too afraid? Like you only show yourself when women are here. Why aren't you
yes.
showing yourself? Then everybody went outside to smoke. Then all of a sudden there was like little like almost like knocks and stuff everywhere. And I was like, okay, if that was you, do it again. It did it again. I was like, okay, this is probably a old house. Like if that was you, knock
Yeah.
twice. And then like it knocked
Yeah.
twice. And I was like, okay, I'm just gonna go outside. And the entire night when I was sleeping, I had the cameras on me just in case like something happened, but nothing did. And I think I freaked myself out the rest of the night, and I was like
Yeah.
sleeping in like a fetal
That's the
position.
thing. When you're at those places, it's creepy and you get this adrenaline going. And as a skeptic, I'm like, I explain it away with that. Like, it's just my imagination, kind of like how people kind of see what they want to see. Like, you can make something into a human form or something. Your mind plays tricks on you, basically. So that's what I think. But also, some of that stuff is like, how do you explain it? I don't know.
Right, right. The family that was supposed to haunt that house, I went to the cemetery the next day and found all their graves, and they died anywhere from like the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And what's crazy about that house is when the original owners like moved in after the family died, the upstairs bedroom was like boarded up, and apparently that's where the children had passed away. And it was just, and that's the room I stayed in was one of the rooms where a few kids had passed away, and it was super creepy.
That is super creepy. We did that too. The next day we went to the cemetery because the cemetery is only about a block or a couple blocks away from the house where it happened. So we always go to the cemetery the next day. Everybody, looks at the graves. It's really sad. You've got 8 little graves of these little kids and then their parents, and it's so sad, really sad. But that's what I try to remember. Like, a case that's so old, you kind of become, you're so far distanced from it because it happened so long ago, and it almost seems like you, it desensitizes you, like, oh, these aren't real stories, these weren't real people. But then when you see their pictures and their graves and stuff, it's like it reminds you, yeah, it happened in 1912, but this was one of the saddest, most horrific murder cases ever to happen in Iowa. And yeah, puts it into perspective, I think. Really
Yeah,
sad.
it definitely does. Like when I went to the cemetery the next day, I was just thinking to myself, I can't imagine being a parent and losing your children and having to go on in life, like losing multiple children. Cause, back then you could die from like the common flu or cold or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah. I mean, people had big families and they would often lose their children, but not often to a brutal axe murder, totally different. For instance, like the two little Stillinger girls who were spending the night that night, their parents, the mother was pregnant at the time, and she was just so overcome with grief. Not only did she lose her two little daughters, Lena and Ina, she lost the baby she was carrying at the time too, because it was just so traumatic.
Yeah,
So
that's
yeah,
that's crazy. I can only imagine.
yeah, yeah, yep.
Where can people find both shows, True Crime IRL and True Crime Sleep Stories, as well as finding you on social media to keep up with everything you have going
Yeah.
on?
Well, I'm very active on social media, probably too active. You can find me, I do a lot on Instagram. You can find me my personal page is at Kelli Brink, KELLIBRINK. You can also follow me at True Crime IRL or at True Crime Sleep Stories. Those are the handles for Instagram. And then I'm on Facebook, same things. And then podcast, anywhere you get your podcasts, you can listen. Just search for True Crime IRL, all one word, because sometimes people break it up and they're like, I can't find your podcast, but it's True Crime IRL, all one word, and True Crime Sleep Stories, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, everywhere you get your podcasts.
Sweet. Is there anything you'd like to add or plug before we get out of here?
Well, I do have some exciting things coming up in the spring that I can't really talk a lot about yet, but I have a new show coming out. It's I think it's going to be different than anything anyone's ever heard before, and I'm working with a wonderful partner on that. So I'm excited for that to debut in the spring. So stay tuned. I can't really give you a whole lot of information about it yet, but it's going to be a pretty cool true crime story, good mystery. So got that. So stay
Awesome. That
tuned for
sounds
that.
exciting.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we can get out of here and, do this again in the future and again and again and again.
Please do. I like talking with you, Andrew. It's great. You're so chill. So it's always a good time. Unforbidden.